bubble's coming, baby. That's what everyone's saying, right?
Yeah.
90% of US GDP growth this year was due to AI.
The interreliance that I think you see with these like very reciprocal billion-dollar bets, it feels like, I guess that is reminiscent of the '08 financial crisis.
Speaking patterns break the code, pre-trained pod.
And welcome back to the Pre-Trained Pod, where AI scientists talk shop and talk shit. I'm Pierce Freeman, AI founder based in San Francisco, where I've built and sold multiple AI startups.
Hey guys, it's Rich. I'm a AI research fellow at the University of Cambridge.
Rich, you're looking real cozy today.
I'm cozy.
It's sweater
dude.
weather in
Christmas.
London, huh?
It's Christmas. It's weather. Having my little cup of cocoa. You know what I mean?
It's honestly been crazy cold here too. I feel like SF is having a major cold snap. It's probably been 42 degrees, 45 degrees for the last couple of days.
Yeah.
In the grand scheme of things, whenever I have buddies that are from the East Coast and say that it's dropped below 20, I think that we're still very lucky out here. But I'm walking around and I'm wearing layers, at least 2.
You're layered up.
Sometimes 3.
It's also funny to me how, like, everywhere else in the world, it's just rainy. And then in SF, you guys have atmospheric rivers.
That's
you know what I
right.
mean? It's just
That's
a
right.
branding thing.
But it sounds intense, doesn't it?
It sounds intense. I was just thinking about this the other day. If people don't know this, apparently, like, I guess the west coast of the United States gets atmospheric rivers. And that's just a fancy way of saying it's raining a lot.
Yeah.
But that's just the norm in the UK, I guess, that we just call it rain out here. It's just called normal weather.
Look, it's all about the branding. Startups are made or break based on how they're branded. And, we're trying to make or break the weather cycles too.
I like it, dude.
Okay, Richard, continuing our trend of episodes that are reflecting upon the past year, I think we have a cool episode today. We can both do some reflection about where AI came from in 2025 and then also look forward to 2026 and think how it's going to change within the next round around the sun.
I like it, dude. This might be a two-parter, frankly.
My reflections on the past year are, I feel like this was the year where AI models really jumped the shark from just consumer adoption in limited niche use cases to being legitimately valuable in the enterprise. I feel like they've become a pretty stable part of the workflow of any software engineer. And then it's creeping into other industries as well. We're going from like the early adopter cohort to slightly laggards, people who are not necessarily people that think of themselves as innovators, but are adopting these models anyway. And I think a big reason why is because the models themselves have just become way better. Like this past year has been this march of the scaling hypothesis to really put this thing to the test. And so far, at least if you believe the benchmarks, it's still continuing to hold true to the theories, right? They're continuing to scale. So I looked up some stats online, and within the last year, so looking at literally from January 1st, 2025 to right now in mid-December, you have a 12.8, 48, and a 67 percentage point increase on MMMU, GPQA, and SWE-bench, respectively. SWE-bench just absolutely run the game in the model improvement racket. And you see that across all of the frontier providers. So like everyone's kind of in this competition of maybe 1 or 2 percentage points. But for one calendar year at least, I'm shocked to see us more or less crack the code on that kind of software engineering task definition.
Yeah, coding tasks are done, dude. We've basically beaten most of these like standard benchmarks at this point. It's pretty crazy. Yeah, that to me is honestly one of the big takeaways from this year. If we were to do like a wrapped, 2025 wrapped for AI,
a pre-trained wrap,
that'd be number one. I think that's like the number one takeaway. If you're gonna take away anything, it's the fact that we've gotten really good at beating these artificial benchmarks. Whether or not that's actually leading us to have better models of coding is another thing, but on paper, we're actually doing super well in these benchmarks. And number two is like so many people are using them, as you were saying. I think across all the different model suites now, 2 billion people are using these providers in the world monthly. That's pretty crazy, dude. That's
crazy.
It's a quarter
That's
of the
1 in
world.
4 people.
Yeah, 1 in 4. And here I wrote this down. 650 million people are using Gemini. That's honestly crazy to me because not that many people are using Gemini. Like most people are obviously using chat. The fact that like more than 500 million people are using Gemini, I think is pretty surprising.
Yeah, you do kind of wonder how they count those statistics. I'm sure if you actually went down into the financial breakdown of how they count a use of Gemini, I imagine a lot of people are using the Gmail plugins for Gemini, and they're counting that as a Gemini invocation. But certainly when you look at the cloud providers that are just supporting AI models like Chat or Claude, the only thing that people are logging on them to do is to talk to a language model. I feel like when you bake it in with a larger company, like you have Meta pushing their chatbots and you have Google pushing their chatbots, I think those numbers are a little bit fuzzy, but Yeah, I mean, you look at, ChatGPT's weekly user base, and it's in the hundreds of millions, creeping up aggressively over time. So ML models are here to stay. Even in their current iteration, without the benchmark improvements, they're continuing to skyrocket. I think maybe we can start with this benchmarks question,
Okay.
right? Of we think the models are doing better, and at least if you believe what are reported by the frontier labs, this year was some breakaway growth for the benchmarking against these different tasks. And maybe I'll also say, since we always talk about these benchmarks, but what exactly is a benchmark and what do we mean by these companies having fulfilled these benchmarks? Well, basically, there are companies out there, university labs, whatnot, that compose these benchmark data sets, usually some combination of hiring people to do some labeling. That's why, companies like Scale AI have gained so much revenue in the past few years, or they have some clever way to synthesize some of these data examples, either deterministically or by using some ML model with a little bit of human labels. But it doesn't really matter how the sausage is made, quite honestly. It's that these are published periodically where people say, this is the latest revision of SWE-bench. And here's a task definition that all of the points in SWE-bench actually fulfill. So, like, I'll give you some code base and some task, and then the solution actually achieving that task is you're able to pass a series of unit tests. So like you're basically grilling the model to see if it's able to do that very thing. That's the only agreement of what a benchmark is. The reporting that is done by saying we achieved X and X score on this benchmark is just saying on the test set that we have designated from this overall set, we've achieved such and such
It's totally
score. So
arbitrary. Yeah.
yeah, you can imagine that there's a lot of nuance or potential game playing that you can do against the benchmark.
Here's a meta point though about benchmarks as a whole. I think when people are developing benchmarks, they're developing benchmarks because they don't think models will be able to perform some task. Like in some sense, benchmarks themselves are very aspirational. Right now, if I were developing a benchmark in 2025, I would say, okay, well, let's see if I give them a video, can they summarize what was in the video and then reproduce an image of the main characters that they saw in this video or something like this, right? That sounds kind of hard. That's not a super trivial task. But the funny thing is that if you look back historically at what benchmarks we were developing in 2010, 2015, those are almost laughably simple now in hindsight. Like I remember when we were at Stanford and we would be working on class projects, one of the big benchmarks would be a sentiment review. You remember this? That was kind of like the standard one. So there would be this data set of IMDb reviews of movies. And the task was, given this review, classify whether or not it's positive or negative. Right. And often
Because there's so much nuance, right? It's like they're double negatives.
Yeah.
People are using sarcasm sometimes. I mean, the sophistication of model that's required. Yeah, totally.
This is what we were studying, like linguistics classes. Okay, well, how do you deal with, if someone says, this movie was not the best thing I've ever seen. And then the model obviously has to interpret, the fine-grained nuances of what does it mean for something to be not bad, not the best, these like sort of like double negation things. And so at the time, it was sort of thought of as a really hard problem, something that you maybe need to, encode in the model specifically, this notion of double negation and the fine-grained semantics of human speech. That was really hard. Now it's laughably easy, right? These models have a profound sense of nuance, almost in a way that is better than humans in some sense, right? Like sometimes I'll ask Claude or Chat to help me out with some, some sort of like advanced, like human level interaction problem. They'll be like, hey, how should I respond to this email in a way that is courteous, but also firm, right? And Chat will do a great job. We'll do a much better job at these fine-grained, like human sort of like social interaction things that I think I couldn't do as well as it does.
Yeah,
right?
totally. People are using chatbots to talk to their Hinge dates.
Yeah, totally.
And their Hinge dates are using Chat to talk back to them,
So I was like, I'm giving up my lease, right? Because I'm moving to SF, as our listeners will know. And so I was like, well, how do I write an email that is both polite, but also cites, the bylaws, telling them that I'm like applying the right amount of notice period time, right? So anyway, I mean, Chat did a great job, right? And it obviously does. It does this thing perfectly. The funny thing is that 10 years ago, like that was thought of as an impossible task. I remember thinking, if models can do this sort of fine-grained understanding of human interpersonal interactions, like that is almost AGI. And now we're doing that, and I don't think we've reached AGI yet, right? So anyway, the meta point here is that the benchmarks we devise are imbued with our understanding of what we think models will achieve in the future. They're like a forward-looking heuristic almost. And the fact that this year was the year where models were crushing tasks from coding tasks like Sweebench to math tasks like Amy and GPQA, it just goes to show that even 2 years ago, things that we thought were going to be impossible for models are now completely solvable, basically. Yeah, I mean, it's insane, dude. It's insane. Do you remember this GPQA task?
Remind me what this was?
So the idea is that it's math questions that you can't really Google, and it's meant to be at the level of a PhD in mathematics. So I think this was the one where they got professors together and they were trying to come up with tasks that they don't think have ever been written before. And so you can't like search for them on Google.
Almost like what they did for our take-home finals.
Yeah,
Where
exactly.
the whole goal was for there to be some question that even if you did have access to your laptop, which they allowed or didn't, but didn't want to give people too much of an incentive to cheat on these things, that you couldn't Google it even if you wanted to. You could maybe Google primitives that would help you solve the
Exactly.
question, but the question itself wasn't out there.
And so in order to solve it, you'd have to really use your own creativity, right? Like take concepts you learned in class, combine them with other things, and then maybe you'll get to the right answer. But like take-home finals were notoriously somewhat tricky. There'd be questions on there where you wouldn't even know if there was like a right answer or not. And so the fact that these models are now actually getting, I think, over 90%, I want to say that GPT 5.2 and Gemini scored over 90% on this task, means it's basically solved at this point. And here's kind of like a meta point about this, Pierce, which it feels like once you get past 90%, it kind of feels like the task is done, right? Because to me, like the remaining 10% kind of just feels like it might be noise at that point, or it almost feels like it's never possible to really get to 100% because there's always going to be a little bit of, bias or noise in the data set itself. So
It's statistical error. You know
that's
what I
right.
mean? It's
Yeah.
like the reality is most of these benchmarks are built off of Amazon Mechanical Turk or Scale, but they're kind of pulling from the same resource pool. Like you have to pay so much money for a real human expert if you want, PhD level accuracy on these tasks. You also need to dedupe across people. So
No.
you have, some pool of like max voting experts that will say, if Richard and Pierce both label this data set and then disagree, we're going to have to pass that to a third person to try to tie break for us and actually figure out what the right thing is. And to do that comprehensively is very expensive, especially with really high paid people, if those people will even do it. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like it's a pretty like mindless task for the most part. So I think there's also a little thing where in a lot of these benchmarks, it's a best effort. So if the models are performing very bad, we can kind of spot check the data set to be able to say, okay, is this data set good enough that we actually think the model should be doing well? This is a task that's actually meaningful. The baseline level of accuracy is there. But yeah, in the 90s, it's kind of like, maybe Pierce and Richard just disagreed. And then the third person that came in disagreed with both of them. And then we end up with kind of a fuzzy score.
And this is especially true for harder and harder benchmarks, right? Because the harder the benchmark gets, the fundamentally trickier the question gets. And so it's very easy to have two experts disagree on,
That's a good question. Yeah.
whether the proof was done correctly in the gold standard answer. So I mean, my prediction would be that in the future, it's actually going to be even harder to get 100% because getting from, 80% to 100%, the last 20%, I would bet that those are always going to be where people have disagreements on, where the labelers themselves didn't know if it was the right answer or not, right? And it's not like they can use Claude to help them out here, right? Because they're literally creating a question that's supposed to be able to trick Claude.
Totally. Yeah. Stump the current best
Stump the
models.
current best model, right?
Yeah. Yeah. The ante's just being like continuously upped. I think there's also a phenomenon going on here where the things that we can actually turn into a benchmark are the things that we can also turn into an RL environment to specifically train the model to be able to do those things. If the task definitions look pretty similar, like even to the extreme of someone booting up an RL environment that's literally just solving Sweebench problems, the model's probably going to do pretty well on a data set that looks like Sweebench,
Yeah.
just because the input output is similar. It's kind of sampled from the same underlying distribution. I've been surprised in the past year that, at least, from my subjective standpoint, the quality of the writing of the models has not gotten much better. Like,
Like, what would you expect to see? Like, what's missing?
well, I'll use an example of literally what I was trying to do this past weekend, which I have this blog post and Rich, we're trying to get bigger on YouTube. We're trying to blow up the show. We're trying to get out there. So many people are searching for content on YouTube in a way that people aren't really searching for blog posts. I've been trying to turn each of my marquee blog posts into YouTube videos. So I'm like trying to use the same kind of setup and talk through these blog posts. But because it's YouTube, you can't really just narrate a blog post. You kind of have to rewrite the blog post as a YouTube video. So you like
totally.
have a script for it with a cadence. And I tried for 5 hours to get Claude and ChatGPT to rewrite my blog post in my tone of voice for a YouTube video that would actually be compelling, and it couldn't do it. It was like way too biased to inject in these LM platitudes or like LM sentence construction and structure. And I just find them to be pretty bad authors. Like whenever I want them to actually, in some sense, actually do what autoregressive optimization is trying to calibrate them to do, which is like just predict the most likely next word given everything that I've given you. You would kind of think that like the best distribution of that would be something that sounds like the previous work that I fed in. And I think that's not true, in part because there's not really a great way to boot that up into an RL environment. You know what I mean? It's not as objective as these scores and these data sets, like being able to do SweBench or like MMLU.
So interesting. I don't know. I mean, I personally have had a fine experience with it, but that's because I think the academic writing that I'm doing is very well formatted and represented in the training data that these models see. So you might be right. I mean, you tend to write more sort of like personal blog post style things where you inject your personal voice into. Academic writing is just kind of meant to be neutral, right? So
That's right.
it would make sense if we haven't had the same experience.
You're almost not supposed to know who wrote the academic
that's
article
right.
if you
That's
think
right.
about it. It's like very devoid of all personality.
The one thing I still want to talk about is Ella Marina because I'm kind of bullish on this. Let me just recap real quick what Ella Marina is. It's actually super simple. It's an arena, and what happens is when
It's like two boxers,
it's like two
they're duking
boxers,
it out.
but they're kind of like anonymous boxers.
Weighing in on the left side of the arena is Model A.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, the
right
way it
side,
works
Model
is
B.
if you're the model provider, you will upload your model to Ella Marina. And then as a user, you can log into Ella Marina. And what you see is basically the output of two different models. And you don't know which ones they are. And then you just get to choose A or B, right? And so you just do that over and over and over again until you get tired. And then you can leave Ella Marina. But as a result of that, Ella Marina basically has all these statistics that they can crunch to see, okay, in these matchups between Model A and Model B, in the back end, they obviously know which one Model A was and which one Model B was. So let's say that they know A was, GPT 5.2 and the other model was, Claude 4.5, Sonnet or whatever. And then they can just see, okay, well, of the times that these models were up against each other, how often, with what probability did Model A beat Model B, right? And what you can do with this statistic, with this information, with these sort of like two-way competitions, is you can crunch something that is known as the ELO score. And this actually exists in any sort of competition where two people go up against each other. So you can compute the ELO score of chess players famously, right? So Magnus Carlsen has a score of like 2,800. A noob
I think
like
that's
myself,
literally the domain in which it came from. Wasn't Elo himself a chess guy?
it's possible. It is possible. I know it's become very decently standard in different rating systems, but you're right.
Yeah,
It might be.
yeah.
It might be. It might be used for
Because
original
any
chess.
face-off inherently has this thing of you don't have one objective truth of who's the best, but you
Yeah.
kind of have like pairwise relationships, and you need to be able to like calculate the global ranking order.
Yeah. No, you're right. I just looked it up. Yeah, you're right. So Arpad Elo was a chess master from
RPOD.
the 1930s. Look at that. United States Chess Federation. Yeah, it's actually a pretty cool metric. What it basically means is, so a noob like myself at chess, I kind of like chess, but I'm pretty bad at it. I might have a score of 1,100 or so. Let's say that I'm playing peers. Let's say you have a score of 1,200, right? So what that means is basically
Let's
that,
assume as a postulate, Richard is better than me at chess.
oh, you're better than me is what I'm saying, God. You got 1,200.
Okay.
All right,
I
whatever.
don't know about that.
So let's say you have 1,200. I have 1,100. So we have a 100-point difference. So a 100-point difference, I believe, means that you then have a likelihood of beating me of 64% or something like that. It's basically like one standard deviation centered at either one of our like ELO scores, right? So if you take a normal distribution, you put it at 1,200, then one standard deviation is 100 points basically. So if you have 100 points more than me, that means that you have a probability of 64% of beating me, right? And then if you're 200 points, you have a 70 or 80% chance of beating me. 300 points, like a 90% chance. So if I'm, whatever, like 1,500 points removed from Magnus Carlsen, I have like a 1 in a trillion billion chance of beating this guy, right? It's crazy.
Yeah.
Anyway, long story short, the take is that you could do the same thing for different models. In fact, right now it's Gemini. So Gemini 3 is the current master, and it has an ELO score of 1492. Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So Gemini
Nice.
3,
That's what they were going for.
that's right.
That's
dude.
intentional.
So Gemini 3 has a score, let's call it 1500. And here's the crazy thing. So people have been talking for a while about what's going to be the first model that crosses 1600. This is like a kind of big deal, or gets a 100-point advantage over the other second
Yeah.
best model. Because unlike in chess, the reason that there isn't a model that's crossed 2000 or has Magnus Carlsen's score of 2800 is because these models all tend to be roughly equally good, is the thing. And that's not true in chess, right? So Magnus Carlsen is so much better than a normal person like me that he's going to have a score disproportionately higher than mine, right? These language models, sure, there's a difference between Gemini 3 and Claude, like 4-1 or whatever, but it's not crazy big. I mean, these things are still pretty good. And sometimes Gemini 2.5 will be Gemini 3 just by virtue of luck and how people are feeling that day, right? So the point here is that unlike in chess, there doesn't really exist the concept of a grandmaster of a language model, right? Like a class of language models that are like grandmasters, at least not yet. But you could imagine at some point in the future when these models see more and more differentiation, that there will be a class of grandmaster models, master models that get over a score of 2000, right? And then they're like the GM of language models.
So this is interesting, right? So if you had, say in another 2 years, all of the frontier models are really blowing it out of the water, like almost any benchmark that we can create, these models just do a fantastic job. Assuming the whole cohort of model providers moves in that same direction at the same time, is it true that the scores will stay basically around 1500?
I think
Because it's a relative measure.
It's a relative
you know what
measure.
I mean? It's kind of like if every chess master that's in the American Chess Federation gets better at the same time, we still want to maintain the same ranked order of all of the people when actually put together. So they should keep the same ratio, I think.
No, well, because like in chess at least, if Magnus Carlsen keeps getting better and better and better, that's because if everyone keeps getting better, but noobs keep entering at the same level, right? The good guys can keep getting better relative to all the bad people like myself. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So
that's true.
The reason with these models is they also include the historical models as part of the ELO system.
Okay, so that's important. Yeah.
Otherwise, you're right, it wouldn't work. But in this case, as models keep getting better, they're going to be compared to Gemini 2, right? Or Gemini 2, whatever, like GPT-4.
Yeah.
That's
and also these random open source models too from a few years ago. That,
exactly.
Weren't that great.
So that'd be cool. Like in 10 years from now, we could do like a retrospective study to see, GPT like 8, how much better is it than GPT-4 or GPT-5? We'll be able to do that. Whenever they release GPT-8. So I'm pretty excited about that. I think it's been really cool that someone had the idea to do this. I think this came out of Berkeley actually initially. So kudos to Berkeley for having this idea.
Credit where it's due.
Yeah, and they've been maintaining this now for I want to say at least 2-3 years. It's been around for a while, so already you can do some like cool retrospective look backs.
Maybe the story with 2025 in a nutshell for me is I feel like we have continued to knock down these dominoes. I think in 2026 I'm sure we'll have more dominoes, but it does kind of feel like people get obsessed with beating one of these benchmarks at every one time. And right now, talking December, it's still humanity's last exam is one of these that people are like, the models are not doing very well. We really need to double down on the focus here. From the historical trends, it seems once the research community has really decided we care a lot about this benchmark, for whatever reason, the next generation of architectures tend to do pretty well against that benchmark.
Yeah,
so
if it wasn't clear, the benchmark itself is called humanity's last exam.
Yes. It's not literally the last exam that humanity will produce. I hope.
This was actually a pretty aspirational title. It's kind of funny that they called it.
It's true.
Humanity's last exam.
It kind of nukes your ability to file a follow-on paper.
Well, it would be funny if they had a follow-up paper called "Humanity's Last Exam" for real this time.
I think what they should really do is humanity's penultimate exam. They should start like backdating them further and further.
Or it should just be humanity's last exam _final_.
V2. Final. Docx. Okay, well, I think another theme, Rich, is the financial side of things, right? These models continue to get better, which is amazing, but it's kind of an engineering research challenge. You know what I mean? There is so much money, real, human dollars of capital
Real
that are trying to
dinero.
back these
Yeah,
models now. Mucho dinero, as I believe they say in the space.
that's right.
I think a lot of people are concerned right now that with the amount of money flowing into AI companies, both the research labs as well as these chipset providers, that there's just not enough revenue potential on the horizon to capitalize and charge for these models that can actually justify these valuations. And I think maybe the bear case that people are saying is because the open source models are 6 months to a year behind the frontier models, even if you want to say a little bit longer, it only takes a brief moment of time for the frontier models to plateau, for the open source models to catch up. In which case, all of this advantage of having these closed source weights that are locked up in the frontier labs kind of becomes null and void. And then also from NVIDIA's advantage, there's increasing competition from Google making TPUs or
Yeah,
Cerebrus or
there's no
Grok
moat.
making their own custom silicon. And there might not be as big of a moat as people hope that they are to be able to maintain these PE ratios that kind of assume you're almost a monopolistic entity in this
Yeah,
space.
at best it's a little moatlet.
Yeah.
Tiny little
So
drawbridge. Yeah,
I think there's been a ton of money flowing into AI for a while now, so that's maybe not the new trend of 2025, but I do think the new trend is how many non-technical people are talking about that funding. Like I feel like in
Mm.
2024, at least in my circles, it was a pretty insular conversation mostly among VCs to say, what are these companies getting valued at and what horses do we back even
Mhm.
at some of these really high valuations? But now I feel like it's actually making the front page news of read through the Times or the Journal. Like people are really worried.
Yeah, the
Um,
bubble's coming, baby. That's what everyone's
yeah,
saying, right?
yeah. And
Yeah.
I guess that's a concern, right? Is because the US economy now is so reliant on this infrastructure spending. I think if you removed data center construction and this Mag 7 worth of stocks from the overall economy, we would pretty much be down for the year, right? The economy's not doing that well.
Yeah, we're at like 0.1% growth or something like that
Yeah.
if you take
Yeah.
away AI investment. Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, this is the craziest soundbite I think has ever existed, which is the fact that 90% of US GDP growth this year was due to AI. It's a little
That's
misleading.
bananas.
I know it's bananas. I mean, it is a little misleading because 90% sounds. I mean, it's true, but it's also not true in some extent. I mean, so basically, I think the U.S. economy would have grown like 0.2%, and with AI, it grew like 1% or something like this. And it's a little misleading because certain of those investments were in energy production or data center creation that maybe weren't necessarily tied with AI specifically. And like I don't know how they calculate that. Like maybe it's just, they're taking the Mag 7 and counting that as AI broadly, even though
Yeah.
obviously these
Yeah.
companies are
Sure.
creating other products like search, like Google search is still growing, right? Google YouTube is still growing, all this stuff. So I don't know to what extent that's true, but it is fascinating to me that we've become so reliant on AI, and obviously everyone now, as you were saying, it's in the zeitgeist and sort of like this in the space of popular discussion now that everyone's aware that we're probably in some sort of a bubble, right? Yeah, man. I remember 2 years ago, people were talking about Mistral, when they raised their
Yeah.
billion-dollar
Yeah. Yeah.
valuation
Yeah.
round, and
That was crazy
everyone's
at
like,
the
that's
time.
insane. They don't have a product. How can they be raising at $1 billion? That's so silly. And now it feels like every other company is raising like a Series A at 500 million or a billion. Like
Yeah.
it's not that insane, right?
Totally. And they're
Um,
also not having to give up 45% of equity to do it, right? Like I
is that what
remember
Mistral did?
Mistral,
Oh,
I
really?
don't know if it's quite that number, but it was a really significant proportion of equity, right? And now you see safe rounds. They might be capped or they might be uncapped. It basically means that you're deferring the valuation of the company to the next round. You see those rounds, even in like the seed and A varietals,
Yeah.
increasing dramatically.
Yeah.
And, a few years ago, it would have been reasonable to maybe put a few $1 million into a safe round, a 50 mil cap. Actually, that's probably even aggressive. Maybe like a $15 million cap for the next round.
They're
Now
capping,
you're
dude.
seeing them in like 100 million caps or $200 million caps for the next round. Like as much as you can use a safe as a forward-looking indicator of what people might think you'd
Mhm.
raise for an A round in like the next year or two, we're still seeing ballooning valuations there.
I feel like people are aware of how crazy these valuations are. Like I was talking to couple friends, and I think everyone's sort of like, we're probably in a bubble, but if we're gonna take advantage of it, we should probably do it now. That's kind of the
Yeah.
mentality of a lot of people today. I mean,
Yeah. I mean,
what do you
I
think?
think that's true
Yeah.
from the venture side, and that's true for people who are raising companies. It's a good time to get capital. I mean, objectively, right? If you're someone who's just trying to lock down some money in the piggy bank for a rainy day, it's never been easier to raise that capital if you're starting an AI company. So I think there's a little element of that. But then that kind of becomes a vicious cycle by itself, right? Where if the venture community starts thinking, we need to insulate our portfolio companies for a rainy day, we're going
Mm,
to give them more money now when our LPs are more willing to give us money at these funds that we're raising, then that encourages them to write larger checks, which encourages people to ask for larger checks so that they'll have more money in the bank. So then, and then, you eventually end up in a situation where, yeah, it's pretty reasonable to put $1 billion into
yeah,
some of
it's
these seed or
crazy.
A stage companies if it's backed by a good enough research team. Do you think that that by itself, though, is really what's giving people pause, or it's more of these circular deals that could potentially be affected if any one of these fail? Like, it almost seems like if you're sampling kind of from this IID success
Yeah.
range, then yes, it would definitely be bad if some venture firms made, a $500 million bet and a lot of those didn't pan out. At the same time, you kind of know the rough success rate of a lot of these venture investments. I think 80% of venture funded companies fail, or maybe the number is even higher. Significant proportion that do survive don't return anything near the capital that was invested in them in the first place, and a couple are breakaway success. That's not going to change in the AI age, even if the numbers kind of change on the margins. But like the inner reliance that I think you see with NVIDIA, OpenAI, Perplexity, whatever, these like very reciprocal $1 billion bets of
Yep. Yep.
NVIDIA putting
Yeah. We
money into
talked about
companies to
this.
buy
Yeah.
chips. It feels like, I guess, that is reminiscent of the '08 financial crisis, of all of these, artificially created securities that were basically interrelated with one another. And then when one of those dominoes fell, it had this cascade. I feel like that actually I think of as a unique concern to the amount of investment that are pouring in these companies by themselves in the early stages. You know what I mean?
I know what you mean. I think if you were to poll people, most people wouldn't cite that as their main concern. I think
Mm,
people would probably say, yeah, that is worrisome, but probably more worrisome is that anyone thinks it's a good idea to pay someone, $100 million to go work at Meta Superintelligence. I think that that's probably the majority of what people are concerned with, or like that's the thing that gives people pause when they reflect on the state of the economy and they realize that, their buddy who was a frat star in college is now making 20 million at Google
totally.
just writing, open source stuff. What? Like, why? Right? That's how a lot of people I think that I've spoken to have felt. And there's this realization that this is insane and also that we should probably take advantage of it now before it disappears. So I think that that's what people are talking about. But yeah, behind the scenes, like these circular deals, I think are definitely worrisome.
I don't really see that talent arbitrage necessarily is like that much of a bear indicator, only because in sports we've been doing that for the last, you know, 10 years, 15 years. I mean,
Hmm.
it feels like rock star talent, like truly top of the top. It's been a little shocking that engineers and product people have not been paid more for their expertise just because they can then bring in so much more. If they have a cult following online, they can potentially get early users, they can like have venture connects that will amount to way more money for the company than the
Mhm.
company had to pay to actually get them in the first place. It's a little bit harder to quantify that value than it is in sports because there's such a direct one-to-one of how many points did you score for your team that usually corresponds to your salary at some point. But yeah, man, the just paying people in general, I feel like as long as the money is there overall, then that's okay. But yeah, I guess it just does feel a little frothy that we're basically debt financing all of these investments, including investments in talent, and we're not really sure yet the business model or the ability to recoup upon that debt payment. And then there might be a ton of these, $20 million
Yeah.
frat stars that are just out of a job in a couple of years.
We should be running some numbers to see how much value do these superstar researchers actually bring the company, like a meta-analysis. Because we do this all the time for sports stars. People will say, oh, Cristiano Ronaldo brought in this much in advertising deals, and based on the probabilities, like we would have probably not won this game if the player hadn't been there, yada yada, right? You can be more quantitative to that extent. But with research talent, I'm not sure. No, I mean, but the circular deals, coming back to that point, is absolutely, I think, something that we should be talking about, or at least should be more in the public conscience. I don't know to what extent it's the same web of intricate deals that led to the collapse of the 2008 financial crisis. I think some of these things, if they do collapse, are still in some sense a good investment for the US economy as a whole. Like investing in energy is probably a good deal. Building out, chip manufacturing plants is always probably going to be a good deal, even if, the thing that financed it collapses. If, whatever, if AMD, for whatever reason, because they sold a bunch of their chips to OpenAI, right?
Mhm.
If that somehow doesn't end up panning out for OpenAI, if they're not ever able to hit the part of the contract clause that would allow them to purchase these chips for super cheap, because they're sort of like this like bi-level multi-tier sort of contract that they signed with AMD,
An
where if they
MLM.
where if they hit a certain level of revenue, then the chips end up being cheaper for them, whatever. But the point is, even if that doesn't work out, and AMD's done all this investment in energy and manufacturing capabilities in the United States, it kind of feels like that is a good thing no matter what, right? With the 2008 financial crisis, if mortgages start failing, that's kind of bad for everyone. There's no upside, there's no like positive externality to that, right?
Yeah,
People
that's
not
true.
being able to service their debt, that just feels like bad. At least with this, there's always going to be some sort of physical good that is actually a positive externality for the US economy as a whole. So I'm a little less worried about it than I would have been in 2008, if I had been an employee, a cognitive
Yeah,
person at that point working in
totally.
the economy.
But by that notion too, I feel like people back in 2008 were loosely aware that the economy was probably ripping in a way that was not sustainable. Like I remember that one scene from The Big Short when they're checking out the Florida
Yeah.
people. And it's, this one woman owns like 3 homes and I think she's a dancer at a club or something. And they're like, okay, this is probably a bubble here. For everything that you do know and you can observe anecdotally, like for all of the circuitous deals that I think are getting play on the front page of the journal, you've got to think that there are 10 deals that link different companies or different projects to one another in a way that just have not really been publicly reported. So I'm always actually way more suspicious and nervous about the stuff that we don't know that the stuff that we do,
Mm,
or the interdependencies that might not be immediately obvious, because usually the ones that are obvious have been mitigated in some way,
yeah,
otherwise they
that's
wouldn't have
true.
happened.
That's
So
true.
I'm curious what your sense is, Richard, not necessarily on the whole ecosystem of financing, but on the balance of within a company, how to think about allocating their GPU clusters to different research topics. And I feel like a big trend in 2025 has been some difference between training and then inference compute. Like in the early days of training these models, when they were just in a research setting, pre even ChatGPT, you wouldn't release these weights at all. So you actually didn't even need an inference serving pipeline. You would just have to train the models. And it was like your whole cluster was just trying to spin on doing research. Now we're switching the balance a little bit where we're trying to maximize the amount of money that we're able to juice from each model that's released. Have you seen that change in ratio in 25 in a meaningful way?
Yeah, I think this is like the third point. If this were like wrapped of 2025, this would definitely be like number 3 for me. Is
What's your listening age?
my listening age? That's a good question,
Yeah,
dude. I think I haven't. So I
you
don't
haven't
want to.
wrapped.
I don't want to unwrap the wrap just because
Mm,
I'm always a little bit disappointed and confused. I'll have my HomePod, just playing
sure.
something, and then it'll just kind of like keep playing.
Yeah, yeah. You've listened to whale sounds
Right?
for
I'm like, what did I
700
listen to this for?
hours.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, I feel like I am a bad statistical outlier for the Spotify
Yes.
data science team. So like my point number 3, I think would be, yeah, that spending on inference has now become the main thing. So we used to think that when we were training models, the way to make the models better is just spending more money to train them to be better. That's kind of like the level 0 take, right? Now I think 2025 was the year where we kind of moved up the ladder of takes. You know that meme where
Mm,
it's like level 0 and then you get to the galaxy level brain take, level 5. I think we're at like level 1 or 2 now, where people have started realizing, oh, well, pre-training is pretty important, but more important than that is what if we could do dynamic computation when at inference time, as we get a request from a user, we can decide how much energy we want to spend, how much
yeah,
computational
this
energy we
is
want to
huge.
spend on the user's input, right? So that if you have a question like, hey, what's 2 plus 2? You don't have to really spend much time, but if you ask, hey, help me design a web page for my banana baking, industry that, employs grandmothers to bake the banana bread, whatever, it'll parse that for you and create you a website.
I feel
Whatever.
like we're on Shark Tank.
Yeah. Just
You're launching Hello Sharks. I'm raising for Banana Co. at a $50 million valuation. I have a
Yeah,
cracked
totally.
team of grandmothers.
It's because I was watching Nona's. It's like this Netflix movie with Vince Vaughn, and the premise is that this guy like opens up an Italian restaurant with just Italian grandmothers cooking.
Oh, this sounds great.
Anyway, what was my point here, though? Oh, my point was that, now in 2025, we've realized that, hey, rather than spending just, all this compute on pre-training, let's still do a little bit of that. But like now, when we get an input from a user, we can dynamically adjust the amount of computations that the model is doing based on the user's request. And I want to say that this actually isn't as hot of a take as it sounds, because basically you can just train the model during post training to align it effectively to have this behavior. Like, this isn't something that's coded in some clever way to make the model smarter. Like, the model itself, you're basically just fine tuning it on a bunch of different chain of thoughts that humans have had. Like, you'll show the model, hey, this is how a human has solved this task, and then just try to do some sort of like imitation learning to copy that behavior. Recently, we've started doing like some more reinforcement learning style approaches to get this model to behave in this emergent way. But at the surface, it sounds like this really fancy thing, but behind the scenes, we're not really doing anything new. Like, this is still the same stuff that we've always been doing. We've just realized that you can fine tune a model to think like a human, and that's pretty much it. But anyway, so people have realized
Isn't
that.
it also true that at least some of the models that have this routing capability that are cloud hosted are actually separate models that just have a routing head? Because there's the routing head of the actual MOE architecture itself. That's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking more about literally you have some query that you send to an API, and then there's some mini model that just says, how complex do I think this is? And then in the background, you have, like 4 different compute clusters set up with different sizes of models, where one's maybe like a 300 billion parameter, one's maybe a 600, one's like a 1 trillion, one's like a 2 trillion. And you save the like 2 trillion for the hardest of hard questions, and you can route to an easier one. I think some cloud providers are doing that, in addition to actually trying to have the model intuit itself how much thinking do I have to do, so I don't have a prescriptive amount of thinking tokens that I'm going to expend on this.
I had this thought many times before, where if you look at academic research papers, because these labs will publish, research papers and stuff, what you just said, I like almost certainly is happening, but there's actually remarkably few papers by these companies detailing exactly what they're doing at this level. Because I think you're right. I think they're definitely doing this like meta model at the sides also, how to route it to different submodels. But most of the papers, if you look up, chain of thought reasoning, we'll be talking about how you can just train a model to have this behavior by itself implicitly. But you're right. I think that there is definitely like bi-level sort of optimizations happening here, where there'll be a gateway model that then decides to send the request to another model, and then that model itself will then also decide how long it wants to think about this thing. I think you're definitely right. I just haven't seen that many papers on that particular like routing mechanism.
I think it's relatively true that at least in OpenAI's case, every model that they're using internally are the same ones that they expose to the API. Besides maybe some of these routing specific models that are a little bit more of their secret sauce. But for ChatGPT 5, they have different flavors of that architecture, right? Like they have GPT-5 mini, they have GPT-5 nano, they have GPT-5 regular, they have GPT-5 codex, GPT-5 pro. So just based on that, I would think that unless there is some reason why they're only choosing one of those architectures to back ChatGPT, they probably are doing a little bit of that routing. I'd be curious to see how big the routing model is, or like what kind of architecture it is. I mean, it's possible that it's not even really a language model. It could just be some statistical, how long, or maybe a TF-IDF based embedding approach. I mean, it could be almost anything.
Yeah, I have no idea. You could imagine at the limit just having one model that is this like really advanced mixture of expert models. Because typically what we've been thinking about so far is when we talk about a mixture of expert model, we think about a model that has like a base, sort of like a couple base layers, and then the last couple layers will have subheads that are good at different things. And typically those subheads all are of the same size, right? But there's nothing stopping you from deciding to have different sized subheads. And those could be massively different at the extreme, where you have one subhead that is, maybe like a 1 billion parameter subhead, and one subhead that is like a 1 trillion parameter
Yeah, it's true. It's a good point.
mixture of expert model itself, right?
Yeah.
So at the very extreme, you could imagine having like just everything all in one model that learns how to route itself, right, to these different complexity mixture of expert models. But anyway, I mean, there's a lot of research being done in this. I actually think that routing, like the routing mechanism itself, is something that still hasn't been fully understood. Because if you look at how we're routing, a lot of it is like hyperparameters. Like we just kind of arbitrarily decide at runtime, hey, we're always just going to route it to the best 5 experts and then combine those results. But that's kind of arbitrary. You could imagine the future having some really clever routing mechanism that is meta learned in some clever way. We're not doing that yet, I don't think. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I think as a result of this clever infrastructure slash, our ability to route things in a better way now, the compute, I think, has gone down substantially in 2025 if you're looking at the level of cost per token. So this is especially true of certain models. Like I think it was Deepseeks that was notoriously cheap, if I'm not mistaken. I think that came down to a couple of bucks, like maybe $5 or $8 or something like that per million tokens generated. Previously, I think this was always in the couple of tens of dollars or hundreds of dollars back in 2024. So that was a big difference, I think, this year, where we saw really cheap models actually being produced.
I remember some podcasts I was listening to of the host who had an app layer company was talking about how Anthropic has really been the only provider that hasn't dropped prices.
Yeah.
Like they've stayed pretty firm for Claude. And I think in the last release, they actually dropped Claude's output price by a little bit, but not by much. So they seem to be keeping the pricing power. But after basically every revision, Google dropped their prices pretty aggressively, I think at Gemini 2, and then it's been creeping back up subsequently to that. OpenAI has basically just been dropping it across the board, I think, as a way of trying to undercut some of their competition. So I think that is happening at the same time that you have on-device neural engines getting a lot better. Like the Apple Silicon architecture, especially in the M4 Max, is fantastic. You can daisy chain a couple of different Macs together in order to host some really big models. Like I think Kimi K, K1, and K2 can be hosted by a couple of different Mac studios. I guess I'm very curious to see what comes next. Is it us doubling down on cloud inference or us doubling down on local inference? I guess we'll see.
Yeah, I guess we'll see. But speaking of, DeepSeek broadly, it feels like the people that have been making some of these biggest advances in cheaper models are these open source models. And I think that would be
Yeah.
like my point number 4, which is the fact that open source models made a big splash last year. DeepSeek, to a certain extent, I mean, obviously there's a company behind it, but it does feel like them and Kimi, right? Like these models did feel a little bit more open sourcey. Like a lot of people were able to use these models and then fine tune them for different purposes, right? Like commercial purposes. And so open source really caught up, I think, in 2025. It didn't feel like you really needed to rely just purely on Llama 3 like we were doing in 2024. In 2025, we had this diversity of models that people could choose from. And that I think has led to, a lot of companies being founded that basically are just wrappers, fine-tuned wrappers of Kimi K2 or DeepSeek, right?
I think one of the particularly cool things about 2025 is that these open models, especially the ones out of these Chinese labs, I think because they were operating in research environments that were so capacity constrained, in part because of UX export controls on these chipsets, they actually had to innovate on some of the core mathematics. Like their train time regimens were different from what we've typically seen. Like they used more shortcuts, they built more optimizers, GRPO as post-training or reinforcement learning technique in order to back prop our favorite examples within this one set came out of the DeepSeek guys, right?
Yeah,
And I think
the
for a
R1
while,
paper.
the Frontier
Yeah.
Labs just had such a massive chip and compute advantage that they were saying, we can continue to do exactly what we've been doing and just scale things up. I think 2025, we saw a little bit of these open source companies having their back behind the wall a little bit more. And I think that actually forced them to innovate a little bit more on a deeper level. I think that was cool. Like I just kind of suspected that we would see the same kind of, GPT or Llama flavor of architectures and train regimes being put in the open source arena too. And we're actually starting to see some like different explorations into architectures or algorithms at train time, pre-training, post-training, as well as in the actual design of the architectures that I wasn't really expecting to see this year.
Yeah, especially not from Chinese companies. I think, Chinese companies historically I've always thought of as being really good at scaling stuff up, like from, like the 0 to 1 move for me has always been something that has originated either in the US or to a lesser extent in Europe. The scaling from 1 to 100, I think China does like very, very well, right? Building out massive data centers, massive like infrastructure projects,
Yeah, factories, totally.
factories, right? To take, an idea that maybe didn't originate in that country, but then really expand it out and make it feasible commercially. What they've done here, though, is kind of like goes against that pattern. In some sense, they're the ones who've innovated. They've come out with GRPO, which, as you mentioned, has really been a tool that has unlocked our ability to do really good alignment and post training. Without GRPO, I don't think we would be able to do a lot of the chain of reasoning stuff that we were able to do this year. A lot of these methods actually rely on this foundational reinforcement learning approach that DeepSeek came out with. Similarly, DeepSeek pioneered the fact that we could distill information down into tiny little submodules. Like they, in some sense, were the ones who showed that a 7 billion parameter model can have the same performance as a 500 billion parameter model,
That's
right?
a good point. Love the
So
sparsity research. A lot of the MOE
the
work also
sparsity
came out
research,
of,
yeah, all this stuff has been really foundational. It's not like a 1 to 100 scaling. It's really a 0 to 1 thing that they were able to do here. So yeah, really cool for Chinese companies. Also, there's been a bunch of meta statistics looking at which country is publishing the most papers on different subdomains of AI research. China has kind of started dominating across the board this year
Hmm.
for the first time ever. Well, maybe not for the first time ever, but really across the board for the first time ever. They're just so dominant in all these different subdisciplines of AI and including open source stuff, which historically the US has led on. So it's interesting to see. I mean, it's like a different world we're living in all of a sudden. China has really caught up and now surpassed the US on these different metrics. So we'll see what happens in 2026. I don't know. If I were to guess, I think China would probably keep doing this, but we can talk about that in a second. So that would be, I guess, like point number 5 at this point. Point number 6, kind of related to this idea, is I want to talk about agents because it feels like, call me crazy here, but we heard about agents in 2024, but in 2025, agents are literally everywhere, right? As soon as I open up my cursor, I'm like, agent
you're
this,
talking to your agent.
agent that,
Yeah.
now incorporating agents. Now you can do, shop with your agent, whatever. Why do you think it was this year that agents are so popular?
I mean, I feel like it was just a technical blocker. Like people have been talking about agents ever since LangChain came out, or even a little bit before that, which at this point I feel like was at least 3 or 4 years ago. What is an agent? I think phrasing the concept of agents as a separate, isolated brand from the language modeling themselves kind of buries the lead because an agent is literally just running a language model in a loop. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah,
like
literally.
every chat query that you give it, you just give it the ability to send you one or a few different messages till it chooses to stop. It can run some tool calls. That's also the thing. And then it yields back to you some product. You give it a new message and then it continues on. It's literally
Yeah.
the same turn by turn conversation that we had in the original version of ChatGPT. I think it was just a technical limitation at the end of the day. It was like the tool calls were not particularly reliable or not reliable enough to be able to do this. The actual JSON construction that they had was reliant on the technical insight of being able to do structured decoding properly. So actually forcing the model to be able to give us valid JSON has been super helpful. And then scaling up the models just to know when to call these tools and when to call them in a precise and efficient way, I think is something that 2025 actually really cracked the code on.
Hmm.
And I think actually, incidentally, for software work, which is probably where agents are most aggressively deployed right now, the focus on using bash primitives as the actual tool calls that are made by the models was kind of this unique insight that came out midway through this year as well. Where I feel like last year, I forget exactly when the model context protocol was rolled out. It's been
I think
such a
that was
wild
1
year.
year ago. I think that
Um,
it's pretty recent still. Yeah, isn't that
yeah,
crazy? Yeah.
so even call that the early part of 2025. I think we've seen this almost full range of inflection this year. For a while, we were thinking maybe we'll just make 1,000 tools, and then these models will just learn when to use these 1,000 unique tools that we've pre-written for the models. And then we tried that. That kind of worked, but it also filled up the context, so it wasn't that reliable. And then people said, well, what if we just use Bash for everything? What if we just teach the model to use Bash and it maybe has access to that and a programming sandbox as the only two things that it can actually call as these tools? And it turns out that's incredibly effective. If you boot up an RL environment to train a model to learn Bash, it can learn Bash, and everything that it does can just be written in bash syntax and calling some of these subcommands of Python. And you've kind of ended up with a Turing complete language model just by training it on that. And I think that that was one of the codes that was really cracked in order to get these agents to take off, was just being able to do these tool calls reliably and simplifying the tool call contract. I think was something that 2025 really brought to the fore.
Yeah, because you're right. Actually, I mean, the ability to use tools is something that isn't new, but it's not that old either. Do you remember the tool former paper from, I want to say 2022
I
potentially?
think so. Yeah.
I know it was 2022 because this was the second year of my PhD, and I remember seeing this paper and being like, "Oh, that's really cool. Now we can actually do like calculator-based questions with LLMs." Because if you remember before that, people were kind of like dunking on GPT for just getting like math wrong all the time, right? You'd ask it like, "Hey, what's 3 plus 10?" And it'd be like,
Mhm.
"Definitely 7," you know? And then this was a meta paper by, I think it was Timo Schick. It's like a meta AI paper where they showed that you could basically just train a model to in natural language use tools. And the tools that it had access to were like a calculator, and mostly it was like Wikipedia, like a Wikipedia RAG based kind of system where you could call out to some like retriever, like a retriever based model that would then retrieve you back the actual snippet of the thing you're looking to solve. And that was it. It was like 2 or 3 tools, and this was pretty game changing. But you're right that the thing that took us from that to now being able to basically do anything is just the fact that we can the tool itself is just bash, right? Like you could just call on your computer to do any sort of arbitrary calculation, right?
Mhm.
Even write its own, I mean, this is maybe like a future prediction, but you could even have it write its own program, right? To solve whatever task it is you need it to solve. Like
Yeah,
if
totally.
that doesn't even exist on your computer, it could just write its own program, call that tool that it just created, and then get the answer back, right?
I've
Um,
seen Codex actually do this a lot. I think of all of the major models, Codex is the most biased to writing an independent Python script to modify some other file. Like if you're asking it to find some instance of, X, Y, and Z across your code base, and it's a non-trivial modification that you can't just search replace, it'll usually write you a Python script to do that logic, run the Python script, and then sanity check the results. It's acting as the verifier, but the actual core logic is implemented in the script. I think the other thing to call out too that was really required for agents to take off is they've gotten pretty good at determining when they should stop executing tools and when they should keep going. And I feel like until they were explicitly fine-tuned for that and actually had some ability to explore the overall environment, like go through this RL discovery phase of things, explore the environments that they had access to and call multiple tool calls to see what they did. We didn't really have any data set examples of these like really long-term task chaining horizons. And I think because of that, even if you put them arbitrarily in a loop, they just wouldn't really know what to do.
mm,
You might be able to do one pass of tool calls and then they would yield back to you. I think 2025 was the year where tool calling got so consistent, both in terms of how they call the tools as well as just knowing how to chain these tool calls together. And I think it's in that arena, actually, especially that open source models are still trying to catch up. But the large
mm.
frontier labs have like really cracked the code on that, in part because of just the amount of RL capacity that they have.
That's true. Yeah, I guess like that is just frankly you can almost think about it as like a separate task. Like when are you done solving this task? That's almost its own hard prediction task, right? I mean, that's gonna keep getting better, I think. I think that's gonna be something that will eventually reach open source models. But yeah, the agents are super exciting. All right, next thing I want to talk to you about is tell me if this reads to you true or not. I wrote
Yeah.
down AI has reached the job application game. What's your takeaway from that? Do you think
Oh,
that's true?
yeah. No, dude, I think from everything that I've heard, applying for a job right now is just hell and a half.
Yeah.
Especially if you just came out of college, like I think once you have been around the block a little bit more, you have more touch points in industry, you've done the networking thing, people that you've worked with in the past have scattered off to all of these companies. They can like vouch as references for you. But I think if you're applying fresh for the first time, it's just so gnarly right now.
Hmm.
I know people that have been trying to look for a job for a year and a half, have submitted like hundreds of applications in order to find these entry level positions that don't even pay that more. And it's kind of the cesspool. You have to submit 120 applications to feel like you even have a shot at getting one job. So you're obviously going to use chat to do that.
Yeah.
But then these companies are being inundated, flooded with
With
applications.
applications, right?
Lease put up a rec a couple months ago, and I think got 1,000 people applying to it within the first 24 hours. I mean,
Wow.
it was an
That's
insane,
crazy.
maybe the first week, it was insane onslaught
Wow.
that she could never go through herself, you know?
Yeah.
So I don't know if she did, but I think a lot of people are now using AI to help filter those candidates because you can't read 1,000 job applications. And then you also have AI starting to interview people as part of the early stages of this panel, where you'll hop on a Zoom call and be talking to some AI avatar.
Oh my God.
And then they'll be evaluating your actual spoken responses in addition to your written ones. So it's just like this whole process, I think, is terrible.
Oh,
It's like
it's
kind of bad on
dystopian,
both
dude.
sides. It's
Yeah.
so dystopian.
Yeah.
At some point, you're just going to train your own AI to show up to the job interview against some
Yeah,
other
yeah.
AI. And then and I think the deeper thing, dude, is I honestly don't know what to do here fundamentally, like systemically how to solve this problem, because I feel like there's so many gating functions of society that have been proxied based on the amount of effort you put into something. Like it used to be so hard to write a job application. You would have to, pull out your typewriter, write a cover letter, write your CV, and then mail it off to someone. That even just by virtue of writing that cover letter, it indicates that you're interested enough in the job to
It's
spend a
tough.
few
Yeah. You
hours
have to put
doing
a lot of
this.
effort in.
Yeah,
Right.
and
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
tells you something about how good of an employee you're going to have, or the stick with itness of the person that you're looking to hire. Now you have none of that signal. Effort is basically free. So how
You're
are
saying bring
companies
it back.
supposed to be able to evaluate?
Typewriters,
Yeah,
mailing. Yeah. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think people can mail me my PO box or drop off in person a
Unironically, that might
handwritten cover
actually
letter.
work. That might be a solution. Maybe not a good one, but there has to be some way to filter out, bots. At this point, like so much of the internet is just bots, right? Even applications. Like you're right. Like you could just have an agent could just go in cursor and say, "Hey, please find me 50 jobs and apply to them. This is my CV. Go for it, buddy."
Yeah.
And it would probably do it. I mean, it would probably do like a decent job, right? So how do you avoid that? I mean, that's kind of the question, right? I don't really know what the right answer is. I mean, frankly, maybe this is a hot take, maybe it's not, but I think frankly, we're gonna see a lot more of interpersonal sort of like family networking connections
Mm.
playing a bigger role, especially here.
Nepotism.
Yeah.
In another
Yeah.
word, nepotism.
Yeah. Kind of, right? If you come from a family where your dad works at Google, right? As a VP there, you're probably okay, unfortunately, right? Because how else are you supposed to do it? I mean, how else would you filter as humans? I think we have such a bias, like an in-group bias, right? To prefer people that we know and are aware of. I don't really know what the answer there is, maybe like some standardized test or something like that you have everyone take somehow. I don't know, man. It's tricky.
Yeah. I feel like right now there is a very thin arbitrage opportunity of being able to be very good at using AI and then being able to showcase some impressive end product that people would get interested in their own right. I'm thinking, if you have some candidate who maybe doesn't have any working experience but has a crazy portfolio of things, if you as a company can't make those things yourself, on some level, I actually don't care if that person used AI to make them or
Mhm.
built them fully from scratch. The fact is they can come into the company and build those things for me. Like it's an existence proof of their capability of somehow getting to the solution that I want. Maybe that's part of it, is like
Well,
more side projects or just moving up, internships become a little bit more aggressive so
well,
you
let
can
me
actually screen people in person.
let me tell you about my experience, man, because I mean, I'm kind of applying for jobs right now, right? And I can tell you, I've actually been very surprised by the experience. So far, I've applied to maybe like a couple, like maybe a dozen or so, or maybe like 20, 15 different things I thought were interesting. Of those, a couple callbacks. I mean, it's only been like a week or two. But what I'll say so far is that of like round 2 and 3, I've never been asked to do a coding interview so far, which has been really
Mm,
interesting, especially with some of the startups I'm interviewing with. All of them just kind of want to hear about my research or have me do some sort of like a research presentation or talk through a paper or discuss like what I think is interesting currently or talk through a hard problem together, like in a very like sort of we're just teammates working on this problem together. How do you think we should approach this? That is not something that I saw 4 or 5 years ago, right? Where typically it was like first round is a coding interview. Maybe it'll be like a phone screen. Let's call that round 0. Round 1 will be a coding interview, and then maybe 2 or 3 calls on like the technical level, and then a final round. I feel like everything's just kind of skipped to a hard screen, of the resume, and then immediately jump into a call where you start talking about your research papers, right? And then followed by give like a 30-minute or an hour-long talk to like a
Yeah.
whole team, right? That's been
Yeah.
my experience, right? And that's like in round like 1 or 2, like you're already giving like a full research talk. And this is actually happening to several companies now.
This feels way healthier. I mean, I've always hated coding interviews. They're so
Me too.
contrived.
Yeah, me too. And I think it makes a lot of sense. Cause yeah, like, dude, like at this point, I've been coding for what, 15 years maybe?
At this point, if you can't code, you can't code.
You can't
You know what I
code,
mean?
you know what I
If
mean?
you're
And
able to do all the research you've done and not know how to code,
that'd be
let
crazy.
the guy not code,
Right,
right?
exactly, yeah. And so I think companies are starting to realize that, which is good. What I will say is that I think that you're right that there is a kind of this hard screening process that has to happen though, because companies I think will go from let's talk to this guy to let's have him present for a whole like research org very quickly, I've found.
Mhm.
Because if you're skipping the whole in between where you do the coding stuff and then like the homework
Yeah, like what else
assignment,
is there, honestly?
there's not much else, right? So you have to be sure like, okay, well, if this person is going to spend, an hour with 6 of our employees, that's kind of a lot of opportunity cost there, right? So let's make sure that, they're decent and then go into that interview immediately.
Mhm.
I think that's been a pretty enlightening to me going through interviews this time around. That's kind of like how it happened, right?
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if that's an answer. I think for you, you're a little unique because you went from the master's to Amazon and then Amazon to a PhD. So you can kind of talk about both the Amazon experience of doing research there and the PhD experience of doing research there. But for a lot of people that just end up going straight through school, they don't really have the industry thing. They can only talk about academic research that they've
Right.
done. I do wonder if maybe that is part of the solution more broadly of if we're because that in some ways is a portfolio. I think it's different than a portfolio that you would typically see in regular systems based CS. But your research is effectively the substitute of your GitHub profile
Yeah.
for these companies.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if we end up moving to slightly more of a state of play where you treat your undergrad or your master's or your PhD as a time to collect as many artifacts as possible that show you being able to solve problems in the real world. So you'll have things to talk about during an interview that people find compelling. And I'd be totally happy to make a hiring decision based on that.
I think
Like
that's what
if
people want to see, man. I think
right.
people want to see little nuggets of projects. They want to see what are the 3, 4 things that you've done that you're really proud of, right? And I think if you've done research, it's pretty easy because each one of your papers is literally like a little project that you can present as a modular unit of something you've accomplished. And
Mhm.
so if over the course of your master's and your PhD, you've written like, I don't know, a dozen papers, it's, yeah, sure, here's like 1, 2, 3, right? You can just talk about those. I think if you're an undergrad, what you kind of low-key have to do is just have a bunch of GitHub projects, or like little things you tinker on. Or if you can write a research paper with a prof, in your like second or third year, that's probably better. But yeah, I think it's become this, it's almost like we're designers. You know how designers need to have a portfolio when they
Yeah.
apply to stuff? We're
Yeah.
kind of like that now too, where as engineers, we have to have a little portfolio of different things we've done, and then show that as little modular units of our talents, right? Where you go, here, look, this is an example of something where I've done a hard like backend thing with the help of Claude. This is something where I've done a really cool like ML thing with the help
With the
of
help of
Claude.
Claude.
But it's like, sure, it's with the help of Claude, but you can tell from this diversity of things that
Totally.
I've been able to do all these different things, right? And I know how to use these tools for these different contexts. And that in and of itself, I think, is kind of impressive, right?
I think if you're interviewing and you can't use a linter, that's
Yeah.
outrageous, right? Or you can't look up the declaration in the doc strings, right? Like no engineering interview would actually be structured that way because I think we've come to this acknowledgement that it's not like you're writing code on punch cards that have to be perfect the first time. There is some element even in non-AI assisted engineering in which you need to be able to use the tools that are standard play in order to write better code.
Right.
And now we have just introduced the addition of AI tools into that ecosystem. And I think interviewers usually shy away from allowing you to use those because they do want to see how you think in the absence of using those tools. But you wouldn't even be that surprised to see in the future, maybe you do still have a coding interview, or maybe you have some application design challenge, but you're actually going back and forth with Claude instead of with your interviewer. And they're grading you in part how are you scoping these prompts? What are you actually telling the model? What are you leaving the model to determine? And what are you specifying in the spec? So we'll see. But I think the job search game macroeconomically, because of AI, it's an absolute mess right now. And I think that's been something in 2025 that was less true in 2024 and way less true in 2018 when we came out of school.
Yeah,
So that's a
absolutely.
changing, and we'll see how it is in 2026. One other observation that I had looking back on this past year, Richard, is that I feel like multimodal models are back in a big way and are actually converging on the same architecture stack as conventional language modeling transformers, where there was a Cambian explosion for a while of different architectures that were trying to do different things. The CV researchers were doing their own thing for vision models. You had the audio researchers doing their own thing. You had the language modeling researchers doing their own thing. And then everyone's kind of comes together and says, okay, we think transformers are probably the state of play. But those models were still trained differently. You'd have a speech recognition model, you'd have a language modeling model, you'd still have some generative model. And now I think we're finally going back to maybe it's just one architecture with weights. We can allow co-learning between these different modalities and we can stick everything into one given architecture. And I think that was true this year that was not true in years past.
I think Gemini 3 especially was the model this year that branded itself as the first multimodal native model. I think in the marketing text, they literally said that we're multimodal native, right? And what that means is basically that they really paid a lot of attention in the pre-training data.
It all comes back to the
It's all
pre-train
the pre-trained data.
pod.
Yeah, exactly. So they really prioritized making sure that every single data point in the pre-training data was tokenized in a way that was sort of irrespective of the modality it came from, so that you could train the model on streams of audio or streams of text or streams of video in effectively the same way. And this basically meant that the model inherently doesn't really prioritize or have a preference for any of these modalities. It's fundamentally native to all modalities, right? And so that was I think this moment that clicked in our heads where everyone realized, hey, we don't have to overfit models to text. We can literally train them on all this data and they'll still do super well in text, right? Because Gemini 3 is a really good text model itself. So if I have to make a prediction for next year, I think all models are going to start really being multimodal native. And a lot of this is just kind of like marketing slang. But their model, Gemini 3, by being multimodal native, was, I think, the model that solved OCR. Being able to recognize text or recognizing where things are on an image, Gemini 3 has been able to solve that. And it's also able, as a result of that, to produce really beautiful images, right? Like Nano Banana looks really, really sick because they were able to leverage some of this information from Gemini 3 and feed that into a model that can then spit out these like really, context aware images in a way that we haven't been able to do before.
Yeah, unbelievable. That was one of the benchmarks for Gemini that I found most impressive was this, screen element recognition system that actually was able to give point outputs of what's happening on the screen in this particular location. Model was obviously trained to do that pretty explicitly. And then the Nano Banana thing. I mean, I've gushed enough about it, but I do think that is emblematic, both that model and then some of the models like Image Z that was released
Yeah.
maybe a couple weeks after Nano Banana of now both OCR as well as the ability to generate images that have text in them are both effectively solved problems. And I do think that it's worth calling out whenever you get to this step change where there's some task that you could not do before and now you can do in a way that is good enough that it works 95, 99% of the time. I think that's also worth checking off our AI bingo card for 2025 to be able to say, I expected image generation to get better. I still thought text generation as part of images was going to be elusive because it's just really hard. And we didn't have models that were pre-existing that were able to do that. They cracked the code on that because of a pre-training regimen on a lot of text data. And that's worth calling out.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's because of them that people are now saying, hey, pre-training isn't dead. Because for a while, people were thinking, honestly, pre-training is kind of easy to do. The hard stuff is
We
the
were thinking
post-training
about a
stuff.
rename of the podcast.
Yeah, we were going to call it the fine-tuning pod, but dude, by God, we stuck with it. I'm happy we did. No, I mean, the pre-training stuff for a while was kind of seen as, whatever. It's not that hard to do. It's just train them all on a bunch of unstructured data. It's fine. But no, I mean, it turns out that structure is really important. Curriculum learning is back in a huge way. People love curriculum learning. The idea being that if you can structure what data your model sees when, that can have some really positive effect on your downstream performance. That for a while was actually thought of as something that was outdated and not really that important. Now everyone's talking about curriculum learning. That's crazy because I think I've always been kind of bullish on curriculum learning. I mean, not to toot my own horn here, but
Oh, you were on this take day one.
I was on this
Yeah,
take
yeah,
day
yeah.
one, dude. I was trying to write papers on this in 2020, 2021. People called me crazy. They thought it couldn't be done. You know what I mean?
But
But
he
no, I
stuck with
mean,
it, and here he is, Dr. Deal.
what is it? It's like first they call you crazy, then they
Yeah,
call
yeah,
you
yeah, yeah,
an
yeah.
innovator or whatever. But no, I mean, curriculum learning is back. Data, thinking about like the data you use, the quality of the data is back in a big way. This is a little segment, but as I've been applying to jobs, I've actually seen a lot of job listings for data curation engineers or something like this. Everyone's talking about, okay, well, can you be a data expert and figure out what data we feed our model when, like this sort of stuff, right? Can you curate and get more data out of other sources that we didn't think were available? These sorts of roles are actually like coming up way more than you'd expect. Anywhere from like Meta to thinking machines has roles for this stuff. It's really interesting. I wouldn't have expected it.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I mean, that's a huge differentiator. I think increasingly so between the different labs. Like, we've kind of tapped out the internet. That's done.
Yeah,
So it's either things that are offline, things that are buried in company vaults, or it's feeding in the same data in different ways or synthesizing data in a way that can get you more data points for some tasks that you want to do. But I think multimodal models, now that we've more or less established that, yes, these help in training, users obviously want them. I think there's some market element of this as well, that we do want some omni model that can kind of do it all. I imagine we're going to continue to see more of that. And I also think a part of that is that we now are in this bracket of context sizes from this 1 to 2 million token length, pretty much for every model that's like true SOTA performance.
that's
It's
a good point.
offered in varietals, it's stretched a little bit longer. And I also have not seen that creeping up dramatically higher. I think it's been plateauing at around 1 million ever since one of the earlier versions of Gemini.
That's
And
true.
that was much earlier this year. And I think that is also reflective of this phenomenon that for a while I was at least thinking that, if we can get infinite model sequence, or maybe, up to 50 million of like really good recall, so many of these downstream problems are going to be solved. Like, RAG retrieval would basically just be a foregone conclusion at that point, because you can stuff everything in memory. It feels like the industry is moving a little bit away from that worldview and saying, we think in terms of cost and value of actually having these things in the attention window, in lossless recall ability to be able to literally just pull those from history. We think 1 to 2 million is probably the right range. And let's instead investigate other, compression, prefixing techniques to use the existing architecture sizes and not have to push that 1 to 2 million that much further, which makes sense. It's this quadratic cost that you incur, even if you have something like the KV cache. So
Yeah. I mean,
it's not that feasible.
making the KV cache effective, I think could even be another point we talk about, frankly. I don't think we should, but I think that, KV caching and thinking about how do you make this quadratic scaling factor that is a problem that is like the bane of Transformers' existence, right? Linear or reduce that in some way. That is, I think, what 2025 was also all about. I mean, all papers almost always talked about, this paper we tackle how to reduce the complexity of transformers from n squared to something else like that. In some sense, all papers were always kind of talking about that implicitly. This has always been the holy grail of transformer research. All right, Pierce. Well, we talked about these like 6 or 7 points. What I want to do next is, what if we talk about things that actually didn't happen this year? What would you say is like the 1 or 2 things that you were surprised to not have seen this year?
I feel like a lot of people were talking about fake news, political deep fakes happening in election cycles. I don't think we really saw much of that. I mean, it was an off year for election in the US, but this tech was readily available last year during the 2024 campaign. And I'll put it this way, at least none of that fake news really crossed my desk. I feel like there were a couple of things that people shared on Reddit that ended up being debunked, but it was as likely to be some recycled video from 4 years ago, some protest movement in another country, as it was to be a true AI generated fake video. And I don't know exactly why that is. It's
I
it's
think
maybe that people can just have more efficient disinformation campaigns via text alone. Like, you don't necessarily need the additional modalities to do something like that.
I think there's some ironic thing happening where, as we've seen what Sora can do, and a lot of people adopted Sora, I think, pretty early, and they were able to, generate their own fake videos. People, I think, got better at having a spidey instinct when something was a fake video. I've been seeing a lot of fakes on my reels, and on YouTube Shorts and stuff. And it's interesting, because like the first couple of comments will always be like fake but funny. You know what I mean? Oh, wish this were true. And it's almost like these two things are now coexisting, where we have fake videos and real videos. The fake videos look almost as good as the real videos. Sometimes they look exactly the same. And it kind of like feels like that's fine. Like people are enjoying both things. It doesn't feel like it's had as much of an impact as I would have thought it would have had. I would totally agree with you. Because we were worried, that like the whole world was going to collapse when you could impersonate someone and then have them say something that they didn't say. There was this feeling in 2020, 2021 that was, going to lead to ultimate misinformation, but somehow it hasn't in some sense. Like I think people have become really good at debunking this stuff. It's almost like a community effort in some sense. So that was a little surprising. I agree with you on that front.
I really, when it comes down to it, I can't quite rationalize why we haven't seen more of this. I think one is maybe just because international politics, this is a politics show, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this point, but it feels maybe like the world's just getting so ridiculous that if you see something in passing, its ability to change your mind or like change your opinion of things is also diminished from what it would have been 40 years ago, when everything was so vanilla. At this point, the second that you have the president of Argentina running around a stage with a chainsaw, I'm like, okay, this is now based on my like plausible distribution. So the
Right.
amount of like additional shock factor that you would have if you had Melee doing something else is just not that big. Because I'm like, yeah,
That's true.
it's I think there's I don't know if that's totally what it is, but
Yeah,
I think there's some element of things where, because we know these things are coexisting, maybe there's slightly more of a snapback to traditional media in some way, where if I'm just scrolling through my reel and looking for memes, yeah, I'll happily laugh at a real meme or a fake meme, and I don't really care. But the second that I actually see something from some real world event that might actually matter to me, I'm going to go to other platforms to try to ascertain the validity of that. And that's kind of like conventional journalism. At least they're usually on the ground. I could see us losing faith in primary source material a little bit, where I feel like for a while, especially during like the Arab Spring, there was a lot of like on the ground reporting from people that just had smartphones. And that was how a lot of international journalists would end up engaging with the thing that was happening. I think that is probably on its way out with Zora. But yeah, aside from that, like the deepfakes, nothing's like really cracked that, which I think is surprising. Something that didn't happen in 2025.
And I think relatedly, I think this falls into this category of AGI not really coming into fruition in the way that we were kind of expecting it to. I think what we're talking about here with deepfakes is part of this broader conversation that people assume that once you have people, have the capability to impersonate another person, that is almost like the ability to, have this like intelligent system that can generate a consciousness out of thin air, right? It's almost, if I can pretend to be you, then hasn't the system learned some sort of like AGI capabilities as a result, by proxy? But the whole conversation around AGI, I think, has also been a little different than I expected it to be. I mean, I think we keep seeing these like shifting goalposts when people talk about AGI, right? But in addition to that, I think there's been a lot more of hesitant voices saying, "Hey, don't believe everything you're hearing out here." Like Jan LeCun, Ilya, right? This year, these like two prominent figures have come out and said, "Look, like we're actually not as close to AGI as some other folks might want you to believe." And their voices, I think, have been like amplified a decent amount this year. So people have been a little bit more apprehensive when they hear these claims of AGI coming, in the next 2, 3 years. I think Sam has also changed his tune a little bit, right? I think there was like this feeling that 2 years ago, like the next GPT model was going to be the AGI model. And I think at this point, everyone's like, yeah, all these models are like about the same. They're all like pretty good. Everyone's making advances slowly. There's not going to be like this, this cliff moment where all of a sudden it's, open AI that has AGI.
Yeah, super intelligence just arrives and no one else can copy it.
Yeah,
I think that's true.
The step function narrative, I think, has diminished substantially, right? I think people feel like if there's AGI that's going to develop, it's going to develop kind of like simultaneously across different labs at the same time.
I think that's definitely true. I feel like this was the first year where I have really lost my calibration to what researchers are saying. and for their ability to predict even the next 6 months out. Because I also think that there are so many financial incentives that are backing basically every prominent researcher in this space. Where, like, in the case of Jan and Ilya, I think that they believe that to be true. They are also starting brand new startups that don't have the data advantage of the companies that they left previously.
Mm.
So it also that helps their case. You know what I mean? I think two things can be true. I think they can believe it, and it also is like in their incentives to believe it, and those are coupled in some way. Whereas, Sam
Dario.
Dario, maybe even to some extent like the big FANG companies
Mhm.
themselves have some incentive to say, no, we actually do think we're going to crack the code, and compute's going to be the thing to do it.
Right.
It's a little hard, I think, right now to listen to researchers one way or another and be like, okay, you're bearish, but why are you bearish? Or you're bullish, why are you bullish? And like, how does that relate to your overall financial outcomes? But I do think, to your point about shifting goalposts of AGI, I think that there's something that might be a little bit limiting or harmful in that, where I think it's very easy to discount these current generation of LLMs based on some kind of pet examples that you feed every generation of models. Like, I feel like the strawberry question is one of the most quintessential ones here, where you ask the LLM how many R's are in strawberry, right?
Classic.
And
Yeah.
then, it usually gets it wrong or it gets it right, but it counts some other R's. These models aren't actually trained on a per character basis. And even if they were, and it got that question wrong, and it's able to just exceed the International Olympiad candidates for the response on these math questions or like CS questions, I also think that there is this element of we do ourselves a disservice when we choose these pet examples that LLMs fail on, and we ignore their overwhelming capacity in other areas where I've kind of changed my internal definition to what is the point at which LLMs can do economically valuable work. And that's my notion of when these things become a potential discussion point or issue in industry and when they don't. And I think in CS, we passed that threshold. I think
Yeah.
in some other areas like healthcare, we haven't passed that threshold. But I do think the notion of AGI being a machine that can interact with humans exactly as you and I would might not just be the most fruitful definition. There are a lot of people that are obviously trying to figure out what that line is and what does that mean. But in terms of just, when are these things useful? It feels like the answer is now or maybe in 6 months. You know what I mean? Have you
Yeah.
updated your priors, do you feel like, on what you think of as AGI or if you think that goal actually matters in
I
the
think
notes
I have. I think I'm still waiting for there to be a big robotics transformers moment in a way that is really going to be game changing. I think robotics has, and we talked about this before, has historically been somewhat hampered by the fact that there just isn't enough data to train robots on real world simulated environments. And it's starting to change. It's starting to change because of these world models. It's starting to change because, robotics, I think, has gotten better at being more data efficient and the algorithms that are used to train these robots. But once we get to a world where, your LLM can, rather than calling on some tool and that, uses the internet, can actually start producing something, right? Like you can imagine your LLM calls on a robot to produce something for you, and then that has some other effect. That then gets into the point where I could see this being like a thing that really sways the US GDP in a massive way.
Yeah.
Right.
It's like, go make me some eggs. Did you see that Instagram reel of the guy who actually got one of these LiDAR robots
No.
and told it to make him some
Oh,
eggs?
really?
This is a hilarious video. He told this little automaton, this was probably, 4 feet tall. It kept hitting his mirror because it thought that it could go through the mirror, and
Oh
it
my
eventually just shattered the mirror
Oh
because
my
it bounced
God.
against it so many times. And then he instructs it to go make him a meal. And it's trying to lift up this pan where there are eggs.
Yeah.
And it can't get the torque right.
Oh
So
my
it
God.
angles the pan back and the eggs slide off onto the robot. At which point the robot drops the pan and then starts slipping on the eggs and then eventually falls down. So I think we still,
dude.
it's a tough look, man. I don't know.
Not have Riz, dude. That's kind of
It
tough.
definitely doesn't have Riz.
Yeah.
So I
once
think
we-
we're
once
not
we solve
there. We're
that-
not there yet.
I mean, imagine that you live in a world where you own enough assets in some ways that, just raw assets, where now you can basically have your robot You can instruct it to be like, hey man, I need to, find a way to generate more electricity or something like this, right? And you can have robots then basically try to do some research by themselves and build, I don't know, like a factory where they produce
Sure.
some, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
at
sure.
that level where if
It's like,
you're,
here's my credit line.
yeah,
Go out and start a company, you know?
yeah, you're like, hey,
Go
robots,
lease some
like
real
I
estate.
have
Yeah.
50 acres of land in Montana. Here's my credit card that has a credit line of $100 million. You guys can walk, you guys can do all this stuff. You guys can use tools to like order stuff online. You can call people. At that point,
Could you
right?
imagine, dude, you get to the Sierra Nevadas and then you just see a chain of robots that are just walking on the side of the road and trying to hitchhike? They're like, we're going to Montana. You want to give us a
You want
lift?
to call? Yeah, exactly. No, but at that point, I mean, then we're done. That is to me AGI. It doesn't really matter if it's AGI or not. Once you can
Sure.
have systems that just produce value and add to the GDP growth in a really clear way, then I think we're done, right? Because then it's like the people that own the assets will just have a way of making infinite money effectively, right? Then it's kind of like hard for anyone else to get access to a share of the pie, right? If you have $100 million, you have a plot of land in Montana, you could just have your AI model just start spending money and create some mechanism of making you a ton of money, right? Do research, set up some like really advanced like energy producing facility or whatever it is, right? But going from the world where tools are these things that models use to search the internet and give you better outputs to where these models are using tools that in the physical world can construct new reality, that is a line that we haven't quite crossed yet, right? And I think in our lifetimes we'll definitely cross that. But that is going to have big economic effects, right? That is really going to be game changing in some ways because then everything is just kind of done at that point. But anyway, I mean, I don't even know what your question was, dude. I think yes.
I think that's a good point. I think AGI, per your definition of AGI,
Oh, right, exactly.
which I think you're more or less keeping true to the traditional one of this is something that can both do this economically viable work, but it's kind of something that has to be able to interact with other human beings at the level of a human being. Where if I ask that robot, yes, I will develop your property in Montana for $50 million, but you have to tell me how many R's are in strawberry first, then it
Yeah,
needs to
who
have the
cares?
whole slate of skills and not just the ones that are niche in these areas. I do think though that those will be easier to regulate because there's something in the real world. If you really wanted to say we're just fully not going to allow robots to interact in society, I could imagine some European countries might decide to do that. The second that you catch a robot out in the wild, you would just arrest the robot or you'd shut it down, you know? I think software is a little bit more difficult to do because it's so distributed and it doesn't actually take that much to run some of these models that our ability to really put a clamp on the usage of AI models to do things is relatively limited. Just has to fall under liability laws if you end up getting caught. Well, Richard, I think that's a pretty good recap of 2025.